Welcome to our second annual 2015 TorontoDV Symposium. Domestic violence hurts everyone, including men, women, and children. Please donate generously at TorontoDV.com. This year, our 2015 TorontoDV Symposium presenters are Dr. Tanveer Ahmed, keynote speaker, Senator Ann C. Cools, Canadian Senator, Lawrence Ben Eliezer, Toronto criminal lawyer, Vernon Beck of Canada Court Watch, Walter Fox, Toronto criminal lawyer, Jasmin Newman, relationship coach, and Paul Elam of A Voice for Men. Special thank you to Sean Sutherland, our videographer, Christian Chiason, sound editor, and the Canadian Maltese Charitable Service Trust, our supporter. Jasmin Newman, a performance coach specializing in helping men who are struggling with relationships and intimacy issues in their lives to gain the communication and connection skills necessary to create deeper, more intimate, and happier relationships with those they love. She helps men who are struggling and feeling lost and alone to move to a place of acceptance and confidence and live a life consistent with their values and beliefs. She believes the power of each man's potential is not only accessible, but readily available when they allow themselves to be true to the man within. Jasmin is a mother of two, author, presenter, coach, creator, and cook. Please give generously at TorontoDV.com to make these events a much-needed and continued reality. Ladies and gentlemen, our next presenter will be Jasmin Newman. She has traveled all the way from Australia. If I get this wrong, just correct me, but I believe Jasmin is a relationship coach. And as a consequence of that work, she has had the opportunity to meet the men, many of whom are having difficulty with domestic violence issues, false allegations, and it really devastates them with their ability to have a relationship with women. As I think Vernon had also mentioned with that boy that was abused, he is living a life of difficulty. Without any further ado, I will have Jasmin do her presentation.
Thank you, everyone. It truly is a pleasure to be here. It was a long trip. Yep, that one. It certainly was a long trip to be here, but I've attended a few things while I've been on this side of the world. Had some meetings and got to meet some great people, and I've been doing some interviews while I was here as well, so that I can help to share men's stories from around the world. The issues that we face in Australia are very similar to the issues that you're facing here in Canada and in America as well. I think probably in the UK, although I haven't been working with many people in the UK for the last year or so, I think across the board the issues are pretty much the same. So yes, Till was correct. I'm a relationships coach, and what I've found is that as much as I wanted my focus to be working with men around their relationships, what I found was needed more was advocacy work for the men's rights issues. And I found repeatedly a lot of damaged men who had been victims of, in many cases, false allegations, or who were just fighting to stay afloat while they were fighting for access to their children. And so, I sort of fell into this line of work. This wasn't where I intended to be, but I've certainly found my place here in being able to share the stories of men. I became a writer when I wasn't one before, but it was a great medium for me to be able to get my message out there and to be able to share the stories of men, which is a big part of my work. But I'm also a big believer in sharing stories and being able to speak out about the things that have happened to us in order to lift a lot of the shame, and I'll be talking about shame and guilt shortly. So essentially I'm a storyteller, but I listen. You know, I listen and I hear the stories of men and I hear their pain. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. Now, why me is something that I ask myself frequently. How did I get here? Why am I here? But it's also a question that I know a lot of people want to know why I work with men. There's a lot to this component. I'll try and keep it narrow, but a large part of my interest in this is raising awareness of female perpetrators and of women who are abusive. There's a number of reasons for that, and I mean, one is the way that it affects men, but the other is the way that it affects children. We're having children being raised in violent and abusive homes, and there's no recognition that their mothers are perpetrators. There's no help for them. You know, if there's a false allegation, the child's left, or if there's an allegation against the father, the child's left in the care of the mother. Nobody's investigating what's happening with these mothers and what's contributing to these children's lives. And like Vern's slide, you know, with the little boy who's angry at the world and angry at women. And I think we're missing a very, very big piece of the puzzle if we don't start to look very closely at female perpetrators of abuse. We have this great misconception that women are naturally nurturing, or that women are always the victim, and that it's quite simply not the case. So that's a little bit of my interest into being here. As I said, it's a rather big story, but that's how I got here. I have a great deal of empathy, and that's something that I'm going to talk about also. But when you're a victim of abuse or violence, it's not something that you would wish onto anybody. But I'm a firm believer that there's a gift in everything, and I think what I've endured myself over my lifetime has allowed me to have a great deal of compassion and empathy for other people that have also suffered. And so, I look for the gift in that, like I look for the gift in everything in life. These days, I haven't always been this way. It's been a long path for me to get here. But if my role now is to turn up as someone who can use that empathy and compassion and understanding to help others, then that's a big part of why I'm here. So, now what I want to talk about today, Attila, could you bring me my water, please? You'll have to excuse me, everybody. So I woke up yesterday with a head cold, so I'm struggling a little bit on my voice projection. Thanks. And of course, what I'm doing is talking about finding your voice. So there you go. I just happen to be losing mine today. So what I want to talk about for victims in particular is about finding your voice and being able to be heard with empathy and compassion. Because what we know with male victims particularly is that when they speak, that they're not being heard. And so therefore they feel like they can't speak. They feel like they can't speak out. This next slide I've shared around quite a few times into my groups, and it always creates quite a conversation. Always speak the truth even if your voice shakes. And, the little child in this is the little child that appears in all of us when we're under a great deal of stress, or when we're confronted with a huge vulnerability of having to speak out. But speaking the truth is something that seems to have disappeared from the domestic violence equation, especially when we're talking about false allegations, but also just the shame that's associated with being a victim and finding that courage to speak out. Why men don't talk. This gets thrown at me a lot in my arguments, especially in social media when I'm putting forward men's arguments, and women will say that men don't speak, and so, men don't speak up about, so, therefore there isn't a problem. There's a denial that men actually have a problem because men don't speak. There's two main reasons, really, why men don't speak. The first one is that they're misunderstood when they do. Often they're blamed when they do speak out, or they're not believed, in entirety. Now, we don't victim blame women, so I don't understand why we victim blame men. So that's a huge one. And the other one really is that no one's listening. You know, there's very, very few services that are available to men who need to find their voice, who need to be able to speak out and say what's happened to them. And they often don't know where to find us. If you Google search, you know, victim of domestic violence, all you come up with is, you know, where you know, that men are perpetrators and women are victims. And there's no resources coming up to the top about this, which is why, you know, I mean, I do my best and I blog frequently and do videos and what have you, and there's a few of us doing this work. But, you know, you've got to search specifically to find support services for men. But I defy this anyway, that men don't talk, because men talk to me every day. Like Vern's experience earlier, you know, with somebody messaging him coincidentally today. Depending on what's going on, and you know, if I've released a blog, for instance, about male victims, I can get, for the following week, I can get 10 to 20 inbox messages a day, or comments to my blog, or emails from my website where men are sharing their stories with me. We say that men don't talk, but I find men talk a lot if we just show up. You know, if we're just there. And it's one of my primary goals is having more online services where men can reach out and can speak. I find a number of times that it's just a like or a comment, an innocuous comment on a post. And if that then leads me to contact a man directly, you know, I've got some guys that, and I don't hear from them for ages, and then all of a sudden they'll like something I post, and I'll know that they're a man who struggles in the world, and I'll send them a message, you know, how you doing? And their reply is almost always, not real good at the moment. And so they need to be heard, and so then I'm available to them to listen. Often this is, being in Australia, I'm dealing with a lot of people over this side of the world, often it's very late at night, sometimes up until 2 or 3 in the morning. But we're not listening in the right way in order for men to be able to speak. What I really want to focus on today is the experience, emotion, issues and impact on men. What men feel but don't necessarily say. Some strategies, I want to share some strategies about being heard, and a little bit about the path to healing for men as well, because if we don't complete this with healing men and getting them to recover, they're going to be stuck in their defence and in their anger and in their pain, and we don't want that for any of us. I didn't go too much into my earlier history, but I know, you know, I grew up a very defensive and very attacking person, and it wasn't until I really did a very big internal journey that I came out the other side, where I realised then that I had to gain some acceptance and some compassion and even forgiveness around what happened to me. And so if we don't finish this journey with healing, then we're not really doing our job properly either, and I think it's a big part that's missing. So I want to just talk about pain for a moment, because this is, you know, I get scoffed at for this, for my points of view when women hear me speak about men and men's pain. You know, they seem to think that men don't feel pain, or that they don't experience pain in the same way that women do. It's utter rubbish. Men feel pain every bit as much as what women do, and men's pain is valid. No one person's pain is any more hurtful or harmful or relevant than another's. We all feel pain the same. It's just how we express it that might be a little bit different. And so men's experience, you know, men experience emotions that present issues and impacts that are unique. They're different to women's experiences. And men, you know, like all of us, we're all individuals, and you know, that may sort of manifest differently in each individual case as well. But they speak about their pain in a manner which is also unique. And it is very different to the way women tend to speak. Women are heard because they tend to have more services around them. They'll speak to friends. Men do communicate in other ways. This little matrix I just put together, I think we've got 4 key issues, which is what I said at the start of this, with the experience that men go through. This is not an exhaustive list, there's certainly many more. The emotions that are attached to those: shame and or guilt, vulnerability, fear, despair, which is a big one, and anger. They're all the emotions that men feel. Now, if I was to be talking about female victims, those emotions are probably, all amongst the things that women experience as well. I know at times in my own life I've certainly felt all of those. Where it goes different is in the issues that men face and the impact of those issues. And so, men are often isolated when they've become a victim because there are no services. There's nobody believing them. They're not being heard. Often homelessness will result, even if it's only short term. These men are being evicted from their homes when they're the ones who have been, when they're the ones that have been the victims. Often, of course, that means leaving their children behind as well. And so that's a big issue and goes back to the isolation. The other issue is threat. Now, I talk about threat quite a lot because it's really our fundamental survival mechanism in the brain. And threat presents as fear. We're looking for that safe place for survival. So I'll talk a little bit more about that again a bit down the track. But the impact of these things is enormous. And again, it all comes down to a lack of services. It comes down to that lack of support. But men feel a great sense of hopelessness. Suicide is a major factor that we're not addressing in society, when 80% of our suicides are men. But we're not talking about that. Nobody seems to be addressing that. Another major impact that affects men in a different way that affects women is the loss of control. Control is taken away from men when they're isolated. So they're powerless. The court system is against them. Their ex-wife is against them, or their ex-partner is against them. The courts, the lawyers, the social services, everything is fighting against them, and they have no power. They have no control. When we don't have control, we've got unpredictability. And so when they can't predict the future, then they go back into this stage of threat, okay, because they can't see any way out. And that it's a cycle that leads back into the hopelessness. And so these are the issues that we need to be addressing for men, finding ways for them to get back some control in their lives. Because at that point, they're feeling like it truly is hopeless. And so this is just a vicious little cycle of what men go through. And of course, financial crisis. Men are the ones who don't have legal aid afforded to them, and so it will certainly, in the case of if their spouse has put a hand up for it, then they're automatically removed from it. I'm not sure if that's the same in Canada as it is in Australia. But they're also home. They're left without a home. They're left having to find somewhere to live. And these things just simply don't happen to women, and they impact men in a very different way. I want to talk about men's anger just a little bit. Primarily, anger is incredibly misunderstood. Anger is not aggression. They're two different things. I get angry all the time. Women get angry. Men get angry. And so what I hear a lot is that men are, if men weren't so angry that this wouldn't be a problem, and men go into anger management. It's not anger that's the problem in domestic violence. It's the aggression that goes with it. So it's a separate thing. Now, when men are victims, they have a right to be angry when they're not being heard, and they have a right to feel anger just the same as women do. It's just probably displayed in slightly different ways. But we misunderstand anger, and we talk about anger in the wrong terms. Nothing irritates me more than these anger management programs, which seem to be incredibly ineffective, and no great surprise why. So there's a right place for anger for men. And a lot of that is in the fight, when they're fighting for their services and they're fighting for acknowledgement and they're fighting to clear their name to get access to their children. They should be angry at those times because there is injustice. And so while ever there's injustice, they're going to have to fight. They need that anger in order to fight. Where anger needs to be removed is in the healing path. Okay, we can't stay angry when we get to the stage of true healing. All right, it's still relevant and it's still prevalent in the first part of healing, which I'll talk about more towards the end. But when we want to let go of all of that, we do have to let go of anger. But until then, it still actually has a place. It has a place in how they communicate. And so I think we need to change the narrative a bit about men's anger because it leads straight to men's pain. And if we're not listening to their anger, then we're not hearing what their issues are. But another thing about anger is that it shows in silence in men. And this is hugely debilitating. When men start to speak out, when they are a little bit vocal, that's when they're starting to get the first parts of acceptance around what's happened to them. But when men are in the victim stage, they tend not to speak. It does show up in silence. And mostly because, as I said earlier, they're being shut down or they're not being believed. And so then that creates this huge culture of shame and guilt in men. So I want to talk about shame and guilt. I just want to talk about the most of the emotions that men experience just quickly. But shame is the most debilitating of all human emotions experienced. I'm a huge fan of the work of Brené Brown, who was a shame and vulnerability researcher. She was trying to find the key to joy and happiness, and so in order to do that, she started to research shame and vulnerability. And Brené says shame cannot survive being spoken about. It cannot survive empathy. And this is something that I have found to be profoundly true. Empathy is the antidote to shame, and I see this all the time. When I turn up on the other end of a chat line or a phone line or a Skype conversation with a man, and he understands that I have empathy for what's happened to him, he will speak. That's all it needs. We just have to show up and remove the shame for men so that they can find their voice. And we can do that through empathy. This next little extract came from a man who's been one of my clients and is very active in my coaching groups, and I actually wrote about this in one of my blogs. And I think this was a really succinct way of putting it into words direct from a man. I'll read it without the profanities, but if you want to help men not suicide, they don't need program or assistance or money, maybe later when they're actually better. But what they need is some empathy, just a simple voice in the middle of the night to say you're not alone. And really it's that simple. He said, trust without empathy is pointless. It's like throwing a bag of gold as a life raft to a drowning man. Now that is raw man's pain. And it was the way it was expressed from a man who has been a victim right from his childhood through into, he's still carrying it through into his adult life. When we're victims as children, unless we deal with that pain early on, we do tend to go on to more abusive relationships throughout our lives. And this was the case for him. So a bit more on shame. Shame displays in how we negatively identify ourselves. Okay, so shame says I am. It's all the I am things that we say. I am not worthy. I am, not man enough. I am not strong enough. I didn't, defend myself well enough. That we get shame around all the things that we say that we attach our identity to. Guilt displays in how we believe we acted. Okay, so guilt says I did. I did ask for it. I did provoke it. I did, look for something to happen to me. But when we believe our guilt, shame becomes debilitating. Now we see this in social media a lot, and we see it in gossiping. just general chit-chat of what people say about somebody else's situation. That man's already feeling shame. When he hears it secondhand, he attaches guilt to that. Okay, so it can be a conversation or it could be a court outcome when the judge says, that's it, you're not to see your children, your wife has full access, and then he's left fighting for those. But he reads that himself as he's guilty. They know that they're not, but the emotions that are attached to that are utterly debilitating. And this is what I believe is leading to a lot of utter despair in men, which is leading to suicide. And this is where I think we need to start to take things really seriously. Vulnerability. This is a big one. Often when I ask this question, what does vulnerability mean? The answer will come back as weakness. And it's also another very misunderstood emotion. We are all vulnerable. And vulnerability takes courage. It's incredibly courageous to stand there feeling vulnerable with your heart on your sleeve and saying, help me, or I need help, or I'm a victim, or I need someone to speak to. But vulnerability takes great courage. But men are vulnerable. We think that strength precludes vulnerability, and it absolutely doesn't. It goes hand in hand. Vulnerability needs trust to survive, and it thrives in a safe environment. And men rarely have this because they don't have the social networks or they don't feel the confidence to be able to speak out. And they don't have, as I said earlier, they don't have the services. Women who are vulnerable have all of this stuff available to them. Men don't have these paths. They're still vulnerable and they still need to be able to speak out, especially to lift the shame and guilt around what's happened to them. Vulnerability is not always successful, right? You don't always win when you're vulnerable, but it's always beneficial. It's always a learning experience, and it's always a way for us to grow. I have been hugely vulnerable sometimes and stepped outside of my arena and kind of gone, here I am, this is what I've got to say, and I've been sort of cut down at the knees. But it's never without a learning experience, and we always grow, because the more we can express ourselves, the more we can express our heart and emotion, then the more we can move forward, especially with our healing journey. Fear, just quickly. This is another thing that's really misunderstood in men. Men will experience fear at the time of the abuse or the assault, but it's also present long after. But they have fear around different things. About a fortnight ago, I was at the CAFE Centre with David Shackleton's talk in launching his book, which was fantastic. And he spoke about how women experience more fear or express more fear, and men will express more shame. And I had to really think about that for a while, because there was something in it that wasn't quite ringing true to me. I agree with him in terms of expression. I think that that's completely accurate. But I think that men just experience fear around different things. And for them, fear, especially after the event, is in family, in security, in predictability of the future. It's just a different form of presenting. But in terms of actual victimhood, I think, the time of the assault or abuse, men are experiencing fear at that point in time as well. I just want to talk about threat quickly, which I mentioned earlier. Many of us are aware of fight, flight and freeze, or most people have heard of fight and flight. Threat is very real to the human brain, and it's what we look for a bit of homeostasis to try and find our safe place. What is misunderstood, I think people know that this exists, but they don't really know what goes on behind it. And so fight is when we're defensive or attacking, okay? There's actually a visceral response. The blood rushes to the upper part of the body, and you kind of, you're ready to attack, you're ready to fight. That's what happens when you're experiencing the fight response, okay? And I don't mean physically being violent, I just mean the blood rushes to the upper part of your body. But it might be verbal, you might be somebody, this was me, this was my entire childhood, until in fact I was about 41 years of age. Always on the defensive. Flight displays in people who will flee from something. the visceral response is different. The blood rushes to the lower extremities, and you're off out of there. If you've got a chance to flee, then you can. I often see this in people when they're talking to me, and if they're sort of dancing around a lot, I know that they're experiencing, that they're in threat. You know, they're not comfortable with the conversation. And you can see it because you can see their feet are moving, and God, if the door was open, they would bolt straight out it. And so you see that a lot, and they're the people who want to run from a confrontational situation. But what's important about this is freeze, which we very rarely speak about. But freeze is that sense of paralysation when you're stuck. You know, you can't move, you've got nothing left, and you're just entirely shut down in where you're at. And this is something that I see that displays a lot in men who are, especially after the event, where they're trying to reach out for services, but they're clouded with all of this thought and these things that are going on in their head, and they will say to me, I'm just stuck, I don't know where to go. And at that point, that's what they're experiencing. They're still stuck in freeze. But it manifests in confrontation as well. It manifests in situations where you're a victim, if you're being a victim of abuse. I was, part of my path, I was violently assaulted in 1994. I was 29 years of age, and I was assaulted by 3 women. I was jumped upon in the middle of the night. I was in my own home, which was a backpackers hostel. But I was in my own home, and I was set upon in the middle of the night by 3 women. Now, I went through pretty much all 3 of those scenarios. So it's not that you just have one, you can go in and out. But in that particular case, I tried to run. That was my first response, which was odd because my first response was always attack prior to that. I tried to run because I knew I was outnumbered, but they got me anyway. And for quite some time, you know, I was being told that this woman was going to kill me, and that's what she was telling me. And she had me by the hair, and she was throwing my head into the pavement. And I was like, that's it, I'm toast, I'm done. And I was shut down, and I was in that freeze state, and I could not get out of it. And it was like there was a bubble around me, but it wasn't protecting me. But it was me saying that I'd had enough, I couldn't win this. And then somehow, in that marvellous way that human instinct does, I came out fighting. And I didn't actually fight her off. Help finally came, thank goodness. But it really helped me down the track in my healing process to understand what got me out of that situation. For years, I couldn't make sense of it until I started to understand the processes. And what got me out of it was my will to live and my will to fight back. So these things present in lots of different ways. And it can be, you know, after an event, it can be in event. But I think, you know, we need to acknowledge that we go through these different processes. We're stuck. It's in freeze. I talked about it too long. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I just want to talk about despair for a little bit now, which was going back to the emotions that I talked about earlier. Despair is something that men experience and men express to me quite frequently. They just say it in different words. You know, I've heard this a lot, and I've actually seen this written before, but, you know, despair is a bit like going down a long, dark corridor and wondering when the light's going to come on. Another man described it to me as going down a dark corridor, and there was all of these doors, but every one of them was locked, and it was like there was no way out. And I think when, you know, hopelessness appears when the light doesn't come on, you know, when there's no help there. And that's where we need to be very aware of the pain that men are enduring. Despair is more prevalent when we're unable to envisage a positive outcome. So when we can't predict the future, when we don't have predictability. And that's often in those times of threat, when we're really struggling for our survival. And of course, despair leads to hopelessness and often leads to suicide. So I think when we hear these cries from men, I think that's the time when we need to really pay attention, and we need to have somebody there to listen. So moving out of that and into getting help and getting services, or even just healing yourself from past hurts. You know, it's never too soon and it's never too late. It's best to speak, you know, going back to vulnerability, it's best to speak when you've got trust, right? When you're in a safe environment and you can accept the vulnerability. Just remember that shame can't survive being spoken about. Those words from Brené Brown are the most profound, I think, that I ever learned in my own journey. It can't survive empathy. So the more we speak about what happened to us, the faster our road to recovery is going to be. And we don't have to stand up on a stage and announce what happened to us. It can be as simple as sharing with a friend, talking to somebody that you trust, speaking to police, or even taking legal action. But connection, we absolutely need. In speaking out, one of the things that men do is diminish their experience. I see this all the time. And this is where I started talking about men's pain is, you know, we all experience pain the same. Men will often say, oh, I knew she wasn't going to hurt me. Yeah, right, she was standing there with a knife. You know, there was a fair chance that she was going to hurt you. But they will diminish their experience out of, you know, a sense of being that man, a sense of being strong or tough. A key for men really is to be able to identify and express their fears, what they're fearful around. And this is what I was saying earlier about their fears are different, you know. They have fears about their personal safety. They have fears about being falsely accused, which we know happens a lot. They have fears about their children or, you know, in fact, ending up homeless. So if men can start to express this and start to speak out about this, then if they can identify what their actual issues are, then it's going to help that path, especially, you know, when it comes time to speaking to the police. Don't invalidate what you're saying, don't diminish what you're saying, and express what your actual fears are. It might not be fear of her or fear of the perpetrator, but it's still fear. You know, you've still got real and valid fears around these things. And I think, you know, the demeanour aspect, I don't even know if demeanour is the right word there, but, you know, we need to be prepared for vulnerability. We need to be prepared that at the time when we speak out that your heart's on your sleeve. We need to be aware of, you know, when anger is relevant and when we need to use anger and when we need to accept that, you know, maybe it's time to put that away just for a moment so that you can express your case. But the other thing is having compassion for yourself and for the path that got you there. Because denial of that, that we weren't responsible for what happened to us is keeping us very much stuck in the victimhood. And so we need to accept compassion for ourselves for what's happened. When you share your story for the first time, this was really very powerful for me, and I find it incredibly helpful for men. The emotional release that you get, I mean, often men will cry when they're telling me their stories. And I've had stories that I've extracted, listened to over a period of days, in one case even a week. A man reached out to me once via Facebook. I'd shared an article about sexual assault, and he reached out to tell me his story about his sexual abuse in his childhood. And he was 67 years of age. He lived on a houseboat. And he had never shared his story previously. He'd not told a soul. But he had made a connection with me. He knew that I had empathy for what had happened to him. And so he felt safe. And he shared his story. But he had to deliver it in, you know, bit by bit, in bite-sized pieces. This story came out. And when the pain got too much, he would say, I'm going. And he would disappear, and then he'd come back an hour later or 2 hours later or the next day. But slowly but surely I got his entire story extracted, and he cried a lot. And he would tell me that he was crying because I was on chat with him. But it's incredibly powerful to get that out. And he says to me now, 12 months down the track, that changed his life, and he feels like he can live his life now. He went to see a counsellor. He got local services. He found somebody to finally listen to him, to understand his pain. This is a man that battled with suicide his entire life, and he's now living his life purely because he shared his story, purely because he felt enough empathy and compassion from me that he felt that he could reach out. It doesn't take much to turn a life around. We get a natural adrenal relaxation. When we're in threat, our adrenaline's all pumped up and we're, experiencing a whole range of emotions. A lot of times, when men speak out, they tell me later that they slept well for the first time in a long time. And that's because they've shared their story. All of this stuff happens. They get to relax for the first time, because you do build up an enormous amount when you're going to be vulnerable. It creates predictability. It gives them some sense of that the future's going to be okay. And it can be as simple as that, just a little bit of hope for the future. It gives them more confidence, and they get to control their outcomes a little bit, because they're a little bit more in charge of their faculties and their emotions and what they're feeling around that. Now, the path to healing really is, it's a long journey. I'm not going to try and simplify it too much, but I won't go into great depth. But, owning your story, which is really just acceptance. It's accepting what happened to you as valid. It's accepting what happened to you as real, not diminishing that experience and not letting anybody else diminish that experience as well. Sharing it, speaking about it. One of the most powerful things that I did was to start to write my own memoirs. And this was really only about 3 years ago. I was on a train on my way to Germany, and I sat down, and over the 5 or 6 hour trip, I just blurted out everything that I had to say into a document. I've never shared that story yet, but I will one day. But all I had to do was get it out. I just had to get it out of me. No one's seen it. I think I have shared it with one other person to read, but all I had to do was get it out of me. And so sharing your story can be anything. Like I said, it doesn't need to be standing up on a stage. It just needs to be getting it out of you. And that might be to a friend, might be to the police, it might be to someone in a services field. And rewriting the next chapter. We're all in charge of what happens to us from here on in. We may not have been in control of what got us to this place, but we're certainly in charge of what will take us from where we are now to go forward. And that's the work that I do. That was the work that I did on myself. I couldn't change what happened to me in my past. I couldn't have changed the way I responded to things. And that's where I have an enormous amount of compassion for myself and for what happened. But we can rewrite our future. We are in control of our destiny, and that's that's kind of the first part of. It's almost like the pre-healing journey, as far as I'm concerned. The final part of this and the final part of healing, really, which is an enormous path. Please don't think this is a snapshot on a slide. Okay, this can take years. But acceptance of what happened to us. Acceptance, compassion and forgiveness are really the key points. Acceptance of what happened to us, what got us there and where we are now. Like gaining that level of acceptance of, well, this is what is, it just is what it is. This is where I'm at. Compassion for your path, and this is where it starts to get tricky sometimes. Compassion for understanding theirs. It doesn't mean forgiveness for what they did to you. It means compassion. It means understanding that what was done to you through what the perpetrator's role came from a path as well. I don't believe that anybody was born evil. Okay, we're all born pure, lovable and loving children, babies, infants. But forgiveness also so that we can heal. Eventually we have to put down the pain that somebody else gave us, and that's our responsibility. Forgiveness isn't for them. We misunderstand this a lot. It's not for them, it's for us. It's for me. I get stuck on this myself sometimes. There's still one key contributor in my life that I haven't quite got there yet. But I will. I know I will. I've got a lot of forgiveness around a lot of other things and a lot of other people. But it's not for them. It's not to let them off the hook. It's to let us off the hook so that we can move forward and get on with the rest of our lives. So that's all I really wanted to cover. I might have whizzed through it a little bit. Does anybody have any questions for me?
Hi, my name is Walter Fox. I'm not sure they're questions, but I have some thoughts, and
Sure.
thoughts that have sort of been concerning me, and I haven't been able to put a handle on them, but they relate to some of the things you've talked about. First of all, on the question of empathy. Every male person is the son of a mother. Every male person has aunts and uncles, or most male have aunts and sisters sometimes. Why is there such a dearth of empathy for men? If women are the empathetic ones, why is it that men are looking for empathy, can't find it? And they certainly can't find it in the environment that we're talking about here. And this all gets very confusing for me, because empathy is what drives men in war. Groups of men are always able to achieve. In the face of odds, in the face of death, men can find ways to relate to each other and keep each other going. What is it that causes a failure in the area we're talking about? I don't know if you have the answer. That's one of the questions. And my questions sort of go in that vein. Anger. One of the things that I think that happens to men, let me start it another way. One of the big differences between men and women in the way men and women are socialized, I don't think it's inherent, but it's the way we're socialized, is men grow up as boys understanding a concept of limited war, a limited fight. I remember as a young boy, if you got the other kid down or if he was crying, it was over. I don't know if you know about North American ice hockey, but it ends the minute somebody is down. There's this notion that you learn how to control violence and aggression. And of course, when I was raised, and maybe it's not true anymore, it was sissy to hit a girl. You didn't hit a girl. So you learned about those things. My experience with women is they have no such concept of limited war. If a woman goes, she's going for the guzzler. She's going to take you down because they don't have this background and experience that we've gotten in this so-called patriarchal society where men have learned not to sort of, I can't say it any more clearly than to fight limited wars. And the other thing about anger is when there were no services, there were a group of us who sort of formed a network, and we would take phone calls even in the middle of the night, and that when somebody was crying because they couldn't get to see their kids, but we all understood. And people would come to my office. I happened to be a lawyer, and if this started to come out of them, I would put my conference button on and call 3 other fellows, all anonymous, who say, I would say, what's the next part of this guy's story? And they would finish it off, and it became, we all knew what was going on. But I think one of the things that happens to men is they get afraid of their own anger at the injustice of being assaulted, the humiliation of being assaulted, and then fear comes up because they're not going to hit back. And their anger is in there, and they're afraid of their own anger. And finally, I don't understand why, again, in this kind of environment in relationships, there's some problem with men with vulnerability. You only have to be on a men's sports team after the age of about 12 or 13 to hear about vulnerability. I missed that check. Gee, I'm not playing well tonight. I got angry. I shouldn't have got angry. And again, this fear of their own anger. He checked me. I should have really hit him, but I didn't. But I should have. So I don't know if those are actually questions, but those are things that went through my mind as I listened to you speak. Do you want to go anywhere with any of this? Or if you don't, I'll understand.
I truly appreciate the insight, and I mean, this is why I love any time a man speaks to me. I love to hear their experiences. In the first part of what you were saying there, where my mind was going, was really the ignorance of women as perpetrators. You know, this great myth that all women are nurturing and caring.
There's a complete denial that any dysfunction can descend through the female side. And it was interesting to hear what you had to say with that in mind, with that sort of bifurcation. And the family law courts deal with this on the basis that if the male person has been violent and the children were there, they will pick up the violence. Of course, they can't conceive of, at this time, although I think things may be getting better, maybe aspirational rather than real, that dysfunction can descend through the female side as well.
Absolutely, it can.
Okay.
And yeah, but I think for any of us, it's a choice what we do with our lives. You know, I don't think that it's being aware of, and I suppose things happening to us at the right time. But I think early childhood abuse is something that we fail, and that's actually what led me down this path, was talking about early sexual abuse with men and the impacts of that down the track. But any form of early childhood abuse is going to impact a child as they grow up and into their adult life.
Would you speak, if you can, to the question I raised about men, the way we're raised in this society, having some sense of limited war and women not? Is there anything in that, or have you thought about that?
It's not something that I've ever thought about. I mean, I've certainly thought about it from the men's point of view, but not so much from the women's, except in my own experience, as I said to you, you know, like the women that were assaulting me, you know, in that period, they were relentless and they weren't going to stop. She was going to kill me. There was no doubt. Enough blows to the head and I was going to be gone, and she knew she had me. But it was only that it was interrupted that I got out of it, even though I was fighting to the end. So in that way, you know, I don't know that women aren't any different. I think when women lash out, the stories that I hear, you know, when women lash out, they're every bit as relentless as what men are. I was just thinking of a story and wondering if I can speak. I'm
trying to argue that men are less relentless. They will back off at a certain point, and that women will be more relentless when they lash out.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and I could even agree, because men know that they need to control themselves. So yes, I think on that point, yes, you're absolutely right. Whether or not there's a stop point for women or not, I don't know that I'm really prepared to say one way or the other, but I do know that, you know, verbally, we're certainly relentless, and this was one of the very things that I sort of first started to speak out when I started to speak out against women in terms of relationships, that, you know, they're just relentless with stuff, throwing stuff at their partners and husbands, and not ever waiting to, you know, to hear or to listen to what it is that you know, men are trying to say. Physically, yeah, I don't know.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Hi, Jasmin. My name's Dean Esme. I've interviewed you before.
Hello, Dean.
You said something interesting there about how you had impulses that made you uncomfortable when you became a mother. Now, my friend Erin Pitsey, back in the 1960s, she's told this story many times, so I'm not talking out of school. She's talking about how in the 1960s she was having urges to violently punish her children when they upset her. And it was upsetting her because she didn't want to be that way. She saw a psychiatrist, and a psychiatrist said, well, maybe you're just a bad mother. Mm. And that says something about how we may actually... I'm normally concerned with male issues, but I got to say, I think we might be failing, and I'd like your response to this. We may be failing young women, and even older women, by not telling them, you might have this problem. And it seems to me, somewhat in answer to the question earlier, men are actually afraid to say women are violent and abusive. They're actually afraid to say it. I'm finding women like you are less inclined to say, women like you are more inclined to say, well, of course we can be. It's almost as if men have a block and don't want to see that. I wonder if you have any reactions to either of those statements.
I certainly identify with what Erin has to say on the subject. And I think we're failing women in general by not acknowledging female perpetrators. We're failing women, we're failing everyone, we're failing children. My major concern is for the children of women who don't have help or don't get help for them, that those children are being raised into very dysfunctional relationships with themselves, usually. But then, go on to further dysfunctional relationships. And, Vern's point earlier, which you guys weren't here for, but about, when children are going into shelters and there's services for children where they're educating about bad men, good women, daddy's violent videos. And what that's doing to the children is like, for children that are victims of female perpetrators, when they're exposed to that kind of thing, then it's like, well, what's wrong with me? Because it's mum that's upsetting me. And so then these children are being raised with this great sense of shame and guilt because they must have done something wrong. So, yeah, I think it's very valid. What was your second part, Dean? Sorry.
Why are women able to see women? It seems somehow that women are able to see women's violence and abusiveness, like men are afraid to see it. Like they can see it and they don't see it.
I suppose
better.
Perhaps it's the emasculation from men's point of view, that they feel emasculated if they're talking about their partner being violent. I had it's like, I think some women will acknowledge it, but obviously a lot don't, because we get hated on quite a lot from women who refuse to acknowledge that women can be violent. But it never ceases to amaze me that every time I show up and speak or say something, even in a forum where there's no men's rights issue, we're not talking about men specifically, but men will turn to me and say, yes, thank you. I was up at a spa centre with my girlfriend last week, a couple of days ago, and there was a young man there doing massage, and I was talking to him about about his choices, about it was an interesting career field for him, and he asked me what I did, and I told him, and he just stopped what he was doing. Now this kid was about maybe 19. He stopped what he was doing and he just looked me square in the eye and he said, thank you. And you could tell that child was a victim. Whether he was a victim of a woman or whether his father was a victim, I don't know. But that instant connection and just that, God, thank you. Same thing happened in the taxi on the way in this morning, Indian taxi driver who, when I spoke out. And, I don't know, I think it just takes us to show up and start to talk about it. And I think if more women could own it, then maybe more women can own their side, more men can own their side of it. Don't know.
Thanks, Jed.
Pleasure.
Any other questions?
Down here.
Your presentation was really good, and I think we really need what you're doing is so valuable.
Thank you.
Do you think shame seems to be more of a, which, I agree that it's one of the biggest things that men are dealing with. Do you not think it's more of a modern thing? It's like, I don't think, if I'm not mistaken, shame wasn't so predominant in prior times. I mean, men have so much to be proud of, all the accomplishments they've done. But then something happened, and there are certain parts of the world where shame is more dominant than other parts, right? Like certain cities, like even Toronto, for example, seems to have a really big problem with male shame, and as a result, you see a lot of feminized men. Is it not?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you started to talk about pride, actually. I think we talk about shame now because we understand shame. We talk about emotions because we understand emotions. Whereas, a century ago that probably wasn't the thing, but you did see, the mark of a man was how proud he was, and a man was allowed to be proud. A man was encouraged to be proud. But these days, in Australia, I don't know if it's the same here, but we have what we call tall poppy syndrome. If somebody gets too high up on the deck, we're ready to mow them down at 100 miles an hour so that they, get back in your box. And I have a huge problem with that because that means that we're not, owning all the things that we are in the world. I mean, nobody wants a skite. Nobody needs somebody who's, really putting themselves out there. But I think we don't want anybody to be more proud than the others. And so I think in previous times, I think it was probably displayed more as pride, was the simple word, that, you know, you were a proud man. And if you weren't a proud man, then you had something to be ashamed of. So I think it's probably more a sign of the times. But, you know, I travel a lot, and I move in a lot of different circles, and I see these issues pretty much everywhere you go. So I think, you know, I think it's the same in Australia, in any Australian city, as what it is in Toronto. That's my thoughts.
Any other questions?
Yes, thank you for your presentation. It was actually quite emotional.
Oh, thank you.
So I really appreciated that. You were talking about fear and shame and guilt and despair. You're bringing up these topics and how they could be connected to male suicide. And I'm wondering if you thought about these topics and how they relate to the human evolutionary instinct to treat males as disposable, and how maybe suicide, through these emotions, through these topics you brought up, can manifest itself. Disposability can manifest itself through suicide, as not being able to feel, you know, valued, that you no longer have a place, and that you won't be missed, or you're maybe a burden to others, and that you can just off yourself and then rid your any burden you present to anyone else. I'm just wondering if maybe, even if it's not necessarily a cultural thing, but something just ingrained in human instinct, that unless we address these issues up front, that this will constantly persist.
Yeah, I think disposability is just another link in the chain that gets you from here to there, which is despair and hopelessness. You know, I know that hope is the saviour of suicide, I think. As long as we've got hope, as long as we've got services, as long as we've got a hand to reach out, somebody to be there, to keep giving hope when, you know, when people can't. I often talk about, you know, that the light comes from within. You know, we all shine our own light. We think that it's coming from someone else, but we've all got our own light. But sometimes we need a hand. We need someone with a brighter torch. And I think, you know, if we had more of those people around to, you know, to be able to reach out and say, you know, yeah, I'm here. You know, you've got somebody to talk to. That sense of despair, that sense of hopelessness would be eliminated. Disposability is something that, yeah, we probably need to talk about more often. I mean, it's often discussed in the men's rights forums and in, you know, various different groups. Maybe it's time for me to start speaking about it as well. I kind of left that one alone, but it's, you know, there's a lot for me to write about. But it certainly is a factor. So yeah, I think, you know, I don't know what the direct answer is to that, except to, you know, more, perhaps just thinking on the run here, but, you know, more bridging programs for men to regain their lives. But, you know, until we get past this first phase of even acknowledging men as victims, you know, we're kind of stuck in that path. So who's going to fund these things? But, you know, I think the Men's Centre here is doing a great job, you know, with running some short courses and workshops and meeting nights and what have you, where they've got counsellors and people coming along to help. So more of that. We definitely need more of that. I've been very inspired to go home and to start something similar at home. Unfortunately, I don't live near a capital city, but anyway, I'll work my way around that. But yeah, I think it's definitely an issue that we need to talk more about. All good?
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jasmin, thank you very much for that incredible presentation. I think you really are going to touch on a lot of hearts, and hopefully it's going to attribute to something that I think is really necessary, is that men understand that it's okay to speak up when they need help. It's really okay. And until the time that they do speak up, we're never going to be able to address the issues that are affecting men. And as our guest had mentioned, suicide We have 8 men to 2 women committing suicide every day in Canada. But I never hear about the male suicide in the mainstream media, whereas today, driving here, they talked about a young girl that had committed suicide. That gets all kinds of media attention. At this point in time, we're going to break for an hour for lunch, and then we will resume after lunch. Thank you. Get your tickets for the 2016 TorontoDV Symposium, June 3, 4, and 5 at TorontoDV.com, TorontoDV.com. Also, please make a donation to help us cover the enormous cost of putting on the TorontoDV Symposium. Thank you.